Today we are going to continue on our investigation of land and water resources. We're going to focus specifically on the topic of public lands and the various kinds of things that public lands are used for. So things like parks and refuges and wilderness areas and wildlife refuge kinds of settings, all those things we'll be examining today. We're going to start by taking a look at Angeles National Forest in the mountains behind Los Angeles, California. This is a vast area of public land, and in fact much of the West is actually public owned in the US. And this area is managed for timber production, although like many public lands, it is also managed for multiple uses. So for recreation and in the forms of fishing and hunting and hiking and things like that. Now here's a very similar kind of a view, but from the other end of the continent. This is the Adirondack Park in northern New York State. So whereas the last few were of Rocky Mountain related kinds of mountain chains, these are Appalachian Mountain related mountain chains. A difference between these areas is that the Angeles National Forest is federally owned land, whereas a good deal of the Adirondack Park is state-owned land, and indeed a significant portion of the Adirondack Park is privately owned as well. It is covered under legislation passed by the state of New York to control the kinds of uses that can occur there. The area, this vast area, especially for the eastern part of the country, is managed primarily for conservation kinds of reasons. And within that, there still is a variety of uses that are permitted, but not all uses are permitted. Now let's again move to a different area. We're now in the southwestern part of the United States at Canyonlands National Park in Utah. And national parks are still another class of public land in which the permissible uses are rather more restricted than they are in things like national forests or even state forests. So in areas like this, the natural features of the landscape, the wildlife, and the landforms themselves, the plant life, those really take precedence over everything else. The principal focus of the national parks is to preserve aspects of the original wild nature of North America's landscape for generations to come, and to alter them as little as possible by human encroachment on these areas. Now, here's another example of an area with rather restricted kinds of land uses. This is Bluff Point State Park on the coast of Connecticut. This area is managed by the state of Connecticut and is set aside as what is referred to as a reserve. What you're looking at here is a pile of rocks that was left here a very long time ago. It is part of what is referred to as a recessional moraine. At the close of Ice Age times, the Wisconsin glacier that extended south from polar regions reached its southern range limit on Long Island, New York. And after a time of being in more or less equilibrium there, it began to melt, but then it stopped again on what is presently the coast of southeastern Connecticut and Rhode Island, and again reached an equilibrium kind of a state here at about 17,000 years ago, and it sat there for a while, and as the ice at the edge melted, all these boulders accumulated there. So the state of Connecticut views this area in much the same kind of a way as we view the national parks, as being areas that possess an unusually great historical natural value in an area that needs to be protected with the minimum amount of human disturbance. Now, to be sure, this area was farmed early in colonial times, so it has received significant disturbance in the past. But the goal now is to leave it in its natural state so that it can evolve back towards a kind of condition that it would have appeared in when Europeans first landed. So, with a good long time of lack of disturbance, a number of native coastal shrub species have recolonized the cliffs, and native grass species and things like that. The forests that lie behind this area include some old growth kinds of specimens of oak trees and other trees that are native to coastal Connecticut. Now let's travel back west to South Dakota, and we're looking here at part of one of the country's national grasslands. This is an area which has a wider range of uses available to it. So human activity on this nationally owned grassland is permitted. So grazing of cattle, for example. Ranchers can lease national grassland to graze cattle on. Although it's also used for multiple use, these areas are also open to some kinds of recreation. So in general, what we see is that there are different classes of public lands, some which are available for multiple kinds of uses, including some harvesting kinds of uses, and others which are primarily set aside for their natural value, and human activity on them is strictly limited. Now here's one last class of public land. This is actually land that is privately owned, but it is available for public use. This is land owned by a land trust. In fact, the most important land trust in the country, the Nature Conservancy, which is an organization that was set up specifically to set aside premier examples of natural landscapes. Now this particular spot here is in northwestern Connecticut, in an area referred to as Cathedral Pines. It's an area that was recognized as being notable because of its stand of old growth white pines that occurred there. Not quite a virgin stand, but an old growth stand with a history that could be documented back at least into the 1700s of not being cut. So it's an area that, especially in the eastern parts of the continent now, are relatively uncommon. Although, to be sure, becoming more common as eastern forests mature to levels that have not been seen since the 1600s. Especially in portions of New England, we're seeing that return of forests to conditions that have not been seen in a very long time. Now this particular area here is exceptionally notable because what you're seeing here no longer exists. I took this photograph way back in the 1970s when the stand was as it had been since the 1700s. Since then, a major storm hit this area, whether it was a tornado or a other kind of substantial meteorological event, knocked most of these trees down. One thing about this stand was that it had never been managed, and so the trees grew close together and they were very tall. They were the better part of 200 feet tall, but they didn't have the structure to support their mass, and so the big wind that came along with the storm knocked them all down. But from the Nature Conservancy's perspective, and from ecologists' perspective in general, this was still an interesting area because it could still be followed from this disturbance, this natural disturbance, to see how this stand would again evolve. And so that is what is presently going on here now, is that the remains of this site are being monitored to track the direction in which plant succession occurs here. So let's summarize a little about what we've just learned. We've seen that public lands are those that are owned by government entities like the states and federal government, but they can also be owned by private entities like land trusts. Now, most public lands are managed by such agencies as the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, agencies like that. At the state level, they're managed by departments of natural resources, departments of environmental protection, those kinds of state agencies. And what we've also seen by looking at these various examples is that some are open to a variety of different kinds of uses, whereas others are set aside primarily for their natural features, and human activity on them is strictly limited. Here is a federally produced map of federally owned public lands in the United States. Note that most of these lands are west of the Mississippi River, with only smaller areas in the east, primarily in the Appalachian Mountains, although there's also a significant parcel in southern Florida. So if we look at the colors on this map, those pink colors are actually Indian reservations, which are not public lands, but a class of lands which have some federal administration. The yellow areas are administered by the Bureau of Land Management. The light green areas are U.S. Forest Service lands. The dark green areas are national parks. And then there's a couple other classes that there are smaller examples of, but those are the big classes. Oh, one other one would be the orange ones, which are administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. These are national wildlife refuges. Now let's turn our attention to parks and wilderness areas in particular. This is a stand of giant redwoods that is under National Park Service control in Northern California. And so this is one of these areas that is available for human access. There are hiking trails through it, but logging is not permitted, and other kinds of active management kinds of activities are pretty minimal. In these kinds of systems, natural processes are what are focused upon. And sometimes, indeed, humans do have to enter the equation some in order to keep these natural processes working the way that they should. But by and large, nature is left to its own devices in these areas. The exceptions to the rule are things like fire. Especially in Western systems, fire has been part of these ecosystems for millennia, and human fire suppression actually has worked to interfere with these systems rather than to promote them. So now on certain national park and national forest and national grassland areas, fire is recognized as being an important and integral component of these systems, and so people have to work to continue to keep it a component. Now here's a little bit different kind of situation here. We're looking at a national forest in the Rocky Mountains of Utah here. And in national forests, multiple use is the rule. And so logging is permitted on national forest lands and things like that. However, there's a special class of landscapes within even national forests that are given special protection, and these areas are called wilderness areas. These are areas into which no roads can be built, and again, natural processes are considered to be the highest and best use of these areas. So basically they're left alone to their own devices. And some of these remote areas in the Rockies that have been undisturbed since European discovery of the New World are being left alone to continue in that state, so that they will always be available for humans to not only admire but to investigate as examples of pristine kinds of systems. Here's still another kind of an example. This is the Cape Cod National Seashore on the coast of Massachusetts, and this is federally owned land. However, its use is strictly controlled. There is beach access here and there is availability for certain kinds of human recreation, but these dune areas are largely off limits to any human foot traffic. They're very fragile systems, and people walking on these is enough to kill the vegetation that grows on them. So they're very ecologically sensitive kinds of areas that cannot support much in the way of human activity. In many cases, they are also rather notable kinds of ecosystems with collections of plant species that in some instances are left over from glacial times, and in other instances are simply notable collections of species that occur in this particular kind of a physical environment. Places that have largely been destroyed by human activity, so in places like the Cape Cod National Seashore they can persist. Now here's another area also on Cape Cod, but this one is owned by the town of Barnstable rather than being federally owned, and you can see that there's a road that goes out here. This road has actually gone out here for many years, even before it was state-owned land. I do believe that this sand road along the edge of the sand dunes where the sand dunes met the salt marsh, this road has been there. But what you can see is that this road alone has been enough to denude the area of vegetation. The passage of vehicles and foot traffic keep dune plants from colonizing this area of sand. So again, let's summarize some of what we've been talking about here. The photo, by the way, is from the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. This is an area within the Olympic National Forest that is set aside as a wilderness area, where there are old-growth Douglas firs that have attained great age and will never be cut. So areas of outstanding natural value are set aside as parks and wilderness areas. And although light recreation is generally permitted in such areas in the form of hiking, backpacking, camping, that sort of thing, any kind of more intensive activity in the form of logging and sometimes even hunting is prohibited in some of these areas, although frequently hunting is permitted. It depends on the particular kind of an area it is and whether hunting is a benefit or a negative aspect. Sometimes hunting is a big plus by keeping down excessive numbers of grazing animals like deer from damaging environments. So when there are not enough natural predators to control things like deer, then hunters can take their place in the ecosystem. Wilderness areas and parks are often roadless and with limited access. In fact, often to get into some of these wilderness areas you need to have a special permit. These wilderness areas are the consequence of the 1964 Wilderness Act, in which areas of particular natural value have been recognized as being important to set aside for future generations. Now let's turn our attention to the topic of wildlife refuges. Now, wildlife refuges can exist at both the state and national level, as well as even the local level, but what we often think of with wildlife refuges are the national wildlife refuges, which was a system of refuges that was begun by Congress in 1903. And it focuses particularly on protecting habitat for waterfowl, but the idea has been extended since then to a variety of other kinds of animals. Generally speaking, hunting is permitted on wildlife refuges, surprisingly enough. Even though they're refuges, they are not refuges throughout the year. And so one of the things that they do is provide hunting opportunities. And opportunities for game animals to build up populations. So, for example, in the summertime, waterfowl might be protected from hunting, but in the late fall, during waterfowl hunting season, then migratory birds coming through the refuge may be hunted. But again, it depends on the particular location and what the needs of that location are. Now, although the wildlife refuge system was largely established for the purposes of providing habitat and protecting game animals, the idea has also now been extended to non-game species, especially at more local levels. Land trusts may set aside refuges that benefit particular kinds of wildlife species that are not hunted. Songbirds, for example, or salamanders and things like that. Now, in the case of wildlife refuges, management of these areas is an integral component, and there are a number of different ways in which wildlife refuges may be managed to benefit wildlife. Strangely enough, hunting can be a very important management tool. By controlling populations, one can have the remaining individuals actually be healthier than if populations become too great and damage habitat and individuals start starving and passing disease among them and that sort of thing. So management of individuals can be a very important part of an overall management scheme for a refuge. Other kinds of things that can be done, it's not uncommon for water control structures to be put in wildlife refuges that are designed particularly to protect waterfowl. So by raising and lowering water levels at different times of the year, that can encourage the development of certain kinds of food plants that are valuable for whatever particular kinds of waterfowl species are being managed for. Food crops can even be planted, sometimes in adjacent upland areas to marshes. Food crops can be planted for spring and fall migrants to supplement natural foods and help to sustain larger populations. It's all a very complex equation. It depends on what the particular goals of the refuge are, what species are being managed for, and what the needs of those species are. So let's take a look at a few wildlife refuges. This is St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge on the Gulf Coast of Florida, which is the southernmost extension of the salt marsh ecosystem. As we get a little bit south of here, salt marshes are replaced by mangrove swamps. And these kinds of coastal ecosystems are very valuable for a whole variety of different species of waterfowl. But in addition to that, there are a number of other kinds of water birds that use these systems that benefit from their protection. So various species of wading birds, the herons and egrets, the anhingas, and all these other kinds of species that feed in wetlands, all of them simultaneously benefit. Now here is another salt marsh ecosystem, but this one is not federally owned. It is managed by the state of Connecticut. As we get to New England, salt marshes also start to decline in distribution, although in this case it's not so much a climatic phenomenon like it is in Florida, but it is a landscape phenomenon where the coast of New England is more steep than the low-lying areas of Florida, and so the land rises quickly enough so that salt marshes don't have much of an area to develop in. But even here, salt marshes are valuable wildlife habitat, including for waterfowl and wading birds. And there are also other kinds of species that live in these things. There are various kinds of invertebrates that live along those creeks. So here in Connecticut we have at least, I think, 3 species of fiddler crabs that live along the mud in those creeks. And then there are a variety of kinds of birds that live. And then there are a variety of birds that eat these fiddler crabs and some of the other little creatures on the mud along these creeks. Things like rails, for example. Rails are a kind of bird that also qualifies as a game bird. There's actually a hunting season for certain of the species in much of the country, particularly the Virginia rail and the Clapper rail, both of which occur right in this marsh in front of us here. Now here's still another state-owned Connecticut marsh. This one is a rather extensive area, especially for New England, the Hammonasset State Park in the central portion of the Connecticut coast. And other things that are interesting about these coastal wildlife refuges are not just what goes on in the marshy areas, the salt marshes, but also what goes on in the adjacent uplands and these scrubby borders. And you can see some of that along this sandy road here. Let's look at another picture that shows it better. This area illustrates a well-developed scrubby border at the edge of a salt marsh. And this community in and of itself is interesting, not just because of the kinds of wildlife that live there, but also because of the kind of plant community that develops here. So wildlife refuges indirectly can also benefit not just animals, but plants. Here's another example of that from the coast of Rhode Island, another area of national wildlife refuge in this case. This stand of swamp forest at the edge of coastal ponds and salt marshes is in itself a notable plant community because of the kind of species that occur there, including species of lichen that, if you look carefully, you can see dangling from the trees in this picture, the beard moss lichens. And this area is notable because of this plant community, and also because of the kind of species of animals that live in it. There is one species of bird, the northern parula, that uses that beard moss lichen to nest in. It is a species that, especially in southern New England, has been virtually absent for the better part of a century because pollution had wiped out this moss. But as air quality has improved in the Northeast, the lichen has recolonized, and now the northern parula is again recolonizing these coastal wet forests where the beard moss lichen grows. Now let's introduce one more topic before we end for today. Let's introduce the topic of wetlands. Now wetlands may be publicly owned lands, but they may also be privately owned lands. But let's focus on the ecosystem here rather than the ownership. Wetlands are areas that we can define as being inundated or saturated by water for much of the year, or at least an important part of it. They are vegetated by plants that require lots of water. And these can include coastal systems, like we've seen with the salt marshes, and we're looking at a salt marsh kind of a system in the background picture here. And in fact, you can even see strands of a taller species of cordgrass growing right out of the water in the foreground here. But also there are freshwater inland wetlands that we can recognize. And there's a whole terminology that has developed around the subject of wetlands. Wetland soils, for example, are referred to as hydric because they're saturated with water. And this can lead to characteristic appearance of the soil. They can often show mottling from the reduction of iron compounds. They can often also accumulate iron sulfides, especially in anaerobic kinds of situations like you find in the mud and salt marshes. The wetland categories include palustrine wetlands, which are swamps and marshes, and we can also throw into that floodplains. We can talk about riverine marshes, which are flowing water in rivers and streams, and lacustrine wetlands, which are ponds and lakes. They provide a number of kinds of ecosystem services. They vary from wetland to wetland in terms of exactly what they do, and also what the underlying geology of the area is, but they do a number of things. They can, but don't have to, function in groundwater recharge, for example, returning water to the aquifer. They can also act in water purification by pulling excess nutrients out of water so that the water that comes out of wetlands can be less nutrient rich than water that comes in, thereby preventing algal blooms from occurring and that sort of thing. They can act as giant sponges and minimize flooding of areas by absorbing large quantities of water during storms. They are also producers of wetland kinds of products, such as the wildlife that lives in them, and even in the case of things like salt marshes, the grasses themselves can be harvested as salt hay. They can also serve as nurseries for game fish. The creeks that flow through the wetlands can be important habitat for species like striped bass during a portion of their life cycle, especially the coastal salt marshes in this case. And on that point, we will end for today. We'll talk a little bit more about wetlands next time, and we'll move on to another topic.